Hello, my name is Arjun Devraj, and I just graduated with a bachelor's degree in computer science from Princeton University. This is joint work with Chong Zhang in the Princeton Science Institute at Princeton and Tom Griffiths in the Departments of Psychology and Computer Science at Princeton. Our work is titled, "The Dynamics of Exemplar and Prototype Representations Depend on Environmental Statistics." Let's consider a scenario in which we have two categories, cats and dogs. Given a particular image, we are asked to determine whether it is a cat or a dog. One fundamental approach to this categorization problem is to compare the object to some general idea we have for this category, this general idea or gist being the prototype. This intuitive approach actually closely follows a computational model in psychology called the prototype model, which more formally uses the term category mean for the prototype to describe the central object in the category that best parameterizes the category as a whole. The formal equation for the prototype model is simple. The probability that we categorize stimulus Si in category 1 is the ratio of the similarity of I to the prototype for category 1, P1, to the sum of the similarity of I to P1 and the similarity of I to P2, where the etas represent the similarity metric. If eta I P1 is greater than eta I P2, then the probability of I belonging to category 1 is greater than 50%, and vice versa. Another approach to categorizing a particular image as a cat or a dog would be to consider the entire set of past instances we've seen of cats and dogs. Unlike the prototype model, this approach is not parameterized by some general summarizing knowledge of the category, but instead requires us to consider all images of cats and dogs we've encountered before in order to make a categorization decision. In the formal definition of the psychological model, known as the exemplar model, we refer to past instances we've seen of a particular category as exemplars. The mathematical formula for a predicted probability in the exemplar model requires us to first sum the similarities between the presented stimulus I to each exemplar X in the given category to obtain a numerical similarity metric to that category as a whole. Then we assess the ratio of the similarity to category 1 to the sum of the similarities to categories 1 and 2 to determine the probability that I belongs to category 1. That is, similarity to a category is no longer determined by similarity to the category prototype, but the sum of similarities to all objects in the category. A 1998 study by Smith and Minda assessed how well the prototype and exemplar models of categorization fit human performance over the course of a categorization experiment. While the study had several different experiments, we focus on experiment 2 with the set of non-linearly separable stimuli. As shown here, there were 14 stimuli evenly split into 2 categories with 7 stimuli each. The stimuli were 6-letter nonsensical words that were modeled by 6-bit binary strings, in which each bit and position corresponded to a unique letter. On each trial of the experiment, the participant was shown one of these nonsensical words and asked to categorize it. The stimuli were presented with constant frequency over time. That is, the experiment was divided into blocks, and each block contained a random permutation of the 14 stimuli, so that each stimulus was seen exactly once per block. And here you can see the exact set of stimuli that were used in the experiment. The results from Smith and Minda's experiment showed that humans tend to categorize more according to the prototype model in early stages of category learning, and more according to the exemplar model in later stages. However, this result actually seems inconsistent with findings in the memory literature, which shows that memory of specific items, exemplars, decays much faster than memory of the gist or general knowledge, or what we refer to as the prototype. So how would one rely more on exemplar-based representations in later stages of categorization when it's actually more difficult to access these exemplars in memory? From a rational perspective, there is no need to retain information in memory if it is no longer needed, as determined by the environmental statistics, according to this 1991 paper by Anderson and Schuler. Memory decay typically obeys a power law function because the relationship between stimulus recency and the need odds often obeys the power law in realistic environments, such as the New York Times headlines, as shown in the graph on the left here, parental speech, and electronic mail. The need odds is the odds that the stimulus will be required in the future. However, traditional category learning experiments use stimuli that appear with the same frequency regardless of the last time the stimulus was seen, leading to overlearning of individual stimuli, which is unrealistic given the environmental statistics encountered in the real world, as seen between the real-world environmental statistics shown on the top and the typical category learning experiment environmental statistics shown on the graph on the bottom. To fill this gap, our current work proposes a categorization experiment under realistic environmental statistics. By constraining the presentation of stimuli to reflect the power law function, the need odds of the stimulus closely follows the patterns observed in Anderson and Schuler's 1997 paper. So our experiment is essentially categorization under realistic environmental statistics. Our hypothesis was that simulating realistic environmental statistics in a categorization experiment will diminish the accessibility of exemplar-based representations in memory over time, therefore reducing or inverting the trend previously observed in favoring prototype-based representations early on and exemplar-based representations in later stages. Our key manipulation was to present the stimuli according to temporally dispersed power law functions for each stimulus. This reflects realistic environmental statistics as shown by Anderson and Schuler, and presents stimuli less and less frequently over time. Our experiment consisted of two conditions, a control condition aiming to replicate Smith and Minda's experiment, and an experimental condition that involved our manipulation of the environmental statistics according to the power law function. We collected data from 60 participants for each condition on prolific and used the exact same set of NLS stimuli used in Smith and Minda's experiment. The control condition was essentially identical to Smith and Minda's, in which the stimuli were presented with equal frequency over time. In the experimental condition, however, we assigned each stimulus a power law function with a 35 trial lag in between consecutive functions, as shown in graph A on the right. The order of power law functions was randomly permuted for each participant. Then we generated a sequence of stimuli by binning the trials into bins of 35 trials and generating a probability distribution for the bin based on the relative values of the different power law functions over the trials in the bin. Then we sampled for the size of the bin times from this distribution to create the stimuli sequence for that bin, and concatenated these sequences together to generate the sequence for the entire experiment. One example stimulus sequence generated from this algorithm is shown at the bottom of the slide here, in which each color corresponds to a unique stimulus. As you can see, for example, with the stimulus represented by the color red, it is first seen with high frequency and then shown less and less frequently over time. This entire stimulus sequence generation algorithm was designed in order to create an experiment with realistic environmental statistics. The graph shown earlier with the power law relationship between stimulus recency and need odds in our experiment was actually generated from the exact stimuli sequences shown to participants in the experimental condition of our experiment. Here are the behavioral results from our experiment. Trials were split and grouped into 11 trial segments, each containing 1/11 of the trials for each stimulus based on when the trial occurred in the experiment. For the control condition, trial segments correspond to chronological groupings of trials in absolute time, exactly as in Smith and Minda's 1998 paper. For the experimental condition, the first trial segment corresponds to the earliest point along all stimuli power law functions, corresponding to highest retention, and the last trial segment corresponds to the latest point, which corresponds to the lowest retention. We can see that the average categorization accuracy increases over time in the control condition, but declines over time in the experimental condition. This is a result of the environmental statistics. There's overlearning in graph A on the left, given that the stimuli frequency is constant over time, whereas the occurrence of each stimulus is less and less frequent over time according to the power law functions in graph B. Therefore, our experimental design was successful at introducing memory constraints that inhibited performance over time. Here we compare the results from our control condition to the results from Smith and Minda's original experiment. In this case, the prototype and exemplar models were fit for each subject and for each trial segment, and we used the sum of squared errors between the predicted and observed probabilities for the entire trial segment as the measure of model fit, just as in Smith and Minda's 1998 paper. Indeed, we successfully replicate Smith and Minda's 1998 results in the control condition, with the prototype model dominating in earlier stages of learning and the exemplar model dominating in later stages. Now we consider the results from the experimental condition, which involved realistic environmental statistics with a power law environmental recency function. In this case, we need a different model fitting procedure and measure of fit than before, because for the experimental condition, trials grouped into a given trial segment were not necessarily seen consecutively in absolute time. We fit the model for each participant for the entire experiment and use the mean squared error over all trials in the trial segment as the measure of fit. This meant applying the model individually to each trial in order to generate a predicted probability for that trial, and then computing the residual on a trial-by-trial basis. We use the same model fitting and fit calculation approach to the control condition just for ease of comparison. That's seen on the left. As you can see by graph A on the left, the same trend seen on the last slide and in Smith and Minda's experiment essentially sticks for the control condition, even with this different model fitting and fit calculation procedure. In the experimental condition, opposite to the trend that's seen in the control condition, we see that under realistic environmental statistics, the exemplar model's advantage over the prototype model decreases over time, as exemplar-based representations become less accessible. So in summary, model results for the experimental condition indicate that with realistic environmental statistics, the advantage of the exemplar model over the prototype model decreases rather than increases over time. How much one is able to utilize prototype-based or exemplar-based categorization is constrained by how accessible these representations are in memory. Our results help to reconcile the findings from categorization and memory literatures. Indeed, unlike traditional experimental scenarios involving constant environmental recency functions, such as Smith and Minda's, memory constraints encountered in realistic environments actually reduce the advantage of the exemplar model over the prototype model over time. So the faster decay of individual exemplars in memory relative to the decay of the prototype, as shown in the findings from memory experiments, more strongly inhibits the performance of the exemplar model over the prototype model later in learning. Thank you, and let us know if you have any questions.